to the trenchers of this world. Between centuries of suffering and torment, many stories can be told, of good and evil, faith and heresy, naive longing and forbidden desire. In another age, the veneer of civilization would have been thicker, and the boundaries between categories more blurred. But this is not the age of the trench crusade. Here, moderation and coexistence are as thin as molecules, and great devotion is contrasted by utter hate. They are, after all, the same. The predator devours the prey. It cannot help itself. The angel cannot shed its light without burning the eyes of the innocent. So let us listen to their stories, lives and no lives spent unnoticed, not only surviving but living and existing, if only for a moment. Let us listen to the voices of the trench. The cadence of silence. In a world shattered by a war both military and metaphysical, the faithful construct vast machines to hear the voice of a silent God. Deep within a hidden valley, the Synod of Strategic Prophecy builds the gate of God, a colossal conduit for the divine, but its construction is plagued by interference. To silence the noise, a small team is sent into the desolation of no man's land, a haunted wasteland where the echoes of the dead drill without end. Their mission is one of calibration, a technical task that will lead them to a ruined basilica whose quiet stones hold a terrible secret and a forgotten king who commands a ghostly army. This is not a story of grand battles, but of a quieter conflict fought in the spaces between words, where the weight of a single name can outweigh the most sacred machinery. Chapter 1. The Ark's Carrier. Frost whitened the prayer stones of the Valley of the Word, a silent hoarfrost that clung to the carved invocations as if heaven itself were reluctant to read them. In the pre-dawn gloom, the valley was a scar of industry and devotion, a deep gorge humming with a low, pervasive thrum. Between the cliffside chapels, where lamplight bled from high-arched windows, and the unfinished colossus of the Gate of God, thick cables sagged and vibrated, transmitting some unseen power. The gate's steepled ribs, a skeleton of iron and faith against the paling sky, blinked with the distant lanterns of the receptors who swarmed its heights, hauling spools of copper nerve to its apex. The air tasted metallic, like a coin held on the tongue, a flavor that Sister Mara Ghislaine had come to associate with the proximity of the divine, or at least the machinery that sought to capture it. Mara stood at the entrance to the calefactory, the workshop carved into the living rock of the valley wall. From within came the roar of white-hot forges and the clear bell-like ring of hammers on orichalcum. Technicians, their faces smudged with soot and their aprons gleaming with flecks of the sacred metal, polished the final tines for new Oculus helmets. Each tap of a tool sent a shivering note through the air, a harmonic that grated against the static already screaming in Mara's skull. The word, as the Synod called it, was not a voice to her, not yet. It was a pressure, a dissonant hum that lived behind her right ear, where the blackened bone suture of her partial skull plating met living tissue. This morning it was more pain than meaning, a drill bit of noise seeking a deeper purchase in her mind. She was chosen for the same reason she was in constant discomfort. Her particular skull graft, a web of orichalcum filaments fused to her parietal bone, happened to resonate with a specific low-frequency band the Synod needed. A forward calibration run, they said, a simple mission. She was to bear the arc of the signal to a site in no man's land, a place where the stone geometry was said to quiet the interference that plagued the valley. The Gate of God could not lock its conduit without new latency tables, and the Ark had identified a ruined basilica as the key. The selection felt less like an honor and more like being singled out as a particularly useful piece of apparatus. Brother Joram Malkai emerged from the calefactory's glow, his shoulders slumped with an exhaustion that seemed to bow the very air around him. The Oculus helmet he carried was a masterpiece of the forge, its visor a single, curved piece of pure orichalcum, but webbed with hairline fractures that caught the light like a spider's web jeweled with dew. He saw Mara looking at the cracks and offered a thin, weary smile. "The calefactory's best work," he said, his voice raspy, "tuned to my resonance. It sings, you know. Sometimes it's all I can hear." He paused, and in a lower, more private tone added, "I have not slept in 3 nights, not without the voices." Before Mara could form a reply, a third figure approached, his footsteps precise on the flagstones. Corporal Kamal Faridun, the Janissary liaison, was a study in stark contrast to the grimy, weary faithful of the valley. His boots were polished to a mirror shine, his uniform impeccably tailored, and a single prayer coin hung on a leather cord around his neck, its surface worn smooth by devotion. His detachment from the Iron Sultanate's artillery was attached to the papal front, a gesture of the fragile, practical alliance that held the line against the heretic legions. His role was to coordinate counter-battery fire if their mission went wrong. He assessed them both with a calm, appraising gaze that held no judgment, only calculation. "The Watcher comes," Kamal stated, his accent clipping the words short. A figure descended the steps from the higher chapels, crowned with horns of solidified light that cast no shadow. The Watchers, guardians of the deepest secrets beneath the gate, were rarely seen, and their appearance sent a ripple of unease through the few other receptors in the yard. This one moved with an unnerving grace, its features obscured within the cowl of its robe. It did not speak so much as project its words into the space between them, a soundless vibration that resonated in their teeth. The conduit falters. The gate is blind. The basilica's silence is required. The Watcher's briefing was a series of stark, imperative statements. You will bear the ark. You will secure the site. You will retrieve the latency tables. A secondary objective, locate and recover the prophetic tactician Luca, lost with a previous observer team near that location. His resonance is valued. Mara's breath caught. Luca. The name was a small, sharp stone in her boot, a private guilt she carried. He was just a child, one of the Synod's most sensitive assets, his mind rewired from infancy to hear the purest frequencies of the word. She used to sneak him dates from the kitchens when his training left him drained and trembling. The thought of him lost in the desolation of no man's land, of the Synod valuing his resonance almost as much as his life, curdled something inside her. She hated the machines, the cold calculus that strung children to them and called it holy. Technicians emerged, wheeling the arc of the signal. It was a chest of dark, oiled wood banded in silver, surmounted by folded antennae that resembled the wings of a metal angel. As they mated the synaptic cables to the ports along Mara's spinal brace, she felt a cold seep into her vertebrae. The device went live with a sub-audible thrum, and a taste flooded her mouth. Frankincense and battery acid, the sacred and the profane, intertwined. Joram's oculus chirred with harmonic feedback as he settled it over his head. He performed the 9-beat calm of the Synod, tapping the sequence against his thigh, a futile attempt to impose order on the chaos in his head. The Watcher extended a hand, offering a thin, flat tin stamped with simple, stark lettering, Psalm of Salt for unbinding. A sealed doctrine code, the Watcher's voice vibration explained, to be run through the ark only as a last resort. Its function is... Kamal took the tin, his expression unreadable. He glanced at Joram, then at Mara. "I trust in fortifications and mathematics," he said, his tone blunt, devoid of the fervor that characterized the faithful. "Voices from machines, they are a variable I prefer to minimize." Joram, his face now hidden behind the shimmering visor, turned his head slightly toward Mara. A whisper, meant only for her, slipped from the helmet's grill. "Do not listen only to the words, sister. Listen for the spaces between them. That is where mercy hides." As the ark's masts unfolded with a series of soft, precise clicks, the team began the descent to the rail wagons that would take them to the front. The weight of the ark settled on Mara's shoulders, a burden both physical and spiritual. And then, cutting through the hum of the device and the dull roar in her own head, she heard it. A whisper, thin and cold, that was neither Joram's advice nor the echo of her own fear. It was a parade ground cadence, precise and empty. "Present arms." The words were wrong, devoid of any divine warmth, carrying instead a hollow, hungry quality that made the fine hairs on her arms stand erect. It was a signal, but not from God. It was a signal from the silence, and it was listening for a reply. Chapter 2, Mud, Wire, and Unholy Music. The rail wagon jolted and clattered, a steel beetle crawling along the scar of the front. Through the grimy window, Sister Mara watched a world reduced to a palette of mud and rust. They passed shattered chapels, their spires snapped like bone, and shuddering ambulances laden with silent forms. Columns of heavy mechanized infantry clanked by, their armor welded with icons of saints and martyrs, their faces grim under steel helmets. High above, a papal biplane circled like a moth around a lantern, its engine a distant buzz against the deeper thrum of the ark strapped to Mara's back. The metallic taste in the air had been replaced by the stench of cordite, damp earth, and something sweetly corrupt. A shudder ran through the wagon as a massive shape lumbered past, going the other way. A shrine anchorite, a walking cathedral of steel plates and piston-driven limbs, its metal ribcage opened to reveal a bell tolling mournfully within. A monk pilot was visible in the central cage, his body a nexus of cables and prayer, his face a mask of serene agony. Slung beneath the construct's torso was a collapsed trench pilgrim, his robes caked in mud. The anchorite's slow, deliberate steps shook the ground, a solemn counterpoint to the wagon's frantic rhythm. Their journey paused at a casualty dugout, a raw wound in the earth braced with splintered timbers. The air was thick with the smell of blood and antiseptic. A dying trench pilgrim, his face a landscape of pain, grasped Joram's arm with a blood-sticky hand. His eyes, wide with a fervor that bordered on madness, fixed on the Oculus helmet. "Brother," he whispered, his voice a ragged tear in the fabric of the dugout's quiet moans. He pressed a small tin into Joram's hand. His fingers were entwined with rosary beads, the wood dark and polished by decades of prayer. For when the pain is holier than the fear. Joram stiffened but pocketed the tin, martyrdom pills. He looked unsettled, the weight of the offering seeming to press down on him more than the ark's cables pressed on Mara. As dusk bled into the bruised purple of night, they left the relative safety of the support trenches and entered no man's land. The world shrank to the few feet of mud illuminated by their hooded lanterns. Barbed wire, strung in endless, rusted thickets, sang a low, keening song in the wind, a chorus of a million tiny, sharp voices. Flares burst overhead, casting stark, lacework shadows that danced and twisted like damned souls. In the intermittent light, the ark's unfolded antennae drew faint, shimmering lines in the dark, a saint's halo rendered in technical diagrams. Kemal led the way, his movements economical and sure, his scimitar a dull gleam at his side. He paused at the edge of a vast crater, its depths pooled with black, stagnant water. From within the crater came a sound that made Mara's skin crawl, a shaking, a tonal hymn. Peering down, she saw the source, a chorister, a heretic abomination. Its body was gone, its head severed and wired to a hand-cranked gramophone. The gramophone's horn amplified the corpse's ravaged vocal cords, producing a hymn that was neither holy nor hellish, but a void of meaning that clawed at the mind. Kemal, without a word of explanation, untied the prayer coin from his neck and laid it gently on the crater's rim. Then he motioned for them to move on, stuffing wax into his ears. Joram and Mara followed suit, the world muffled to a dull roar, the unholy music now a distant vibration. They skirted the crater, their boots sinking into the viscous mud. Ahead, in the shell-pocked earth of another depression, a drill was underway. A squad of trench ghost troopers, their uniforms faded and rotted, their eyes burning with a cold, residual spite, moved in perfect, silent unison. They shouldered phantom rifles, performed the manual of arms with a precision that death had not eroded. There was no sergeant, no shouted commands, only the ghost of discipline, the habit of war etched into their spectral forms. The arc on Mara's back gave a sudden sharp twitch, its printing needle jerking in time with their silent, relentless rhythm. Joram placed a hand on the device, his head tilted as if listening to a frequency only he could perceive. Their destination rose from the mist ahead. The ruined basilica. It was a half-buried nave, its roof torn away, the walls leaning at precarious angles. Saints carved into the stone were sodden with mud, their faces eroded into anonymous grief. They picked their way through the shattered pews, the wind carrying scraps of paper and the faint, ghostly smell of old wine, a memory of sanctity long profaned. Joram knelt, his oculus visor scanning the shadows. He pointed under a pew that had been crushed by fallen masonry. There, amidst the splinters, lay a shattered oculus helmet, its orichalcum visor cracked into a spiderweb. Joram carefully extracted a small, gleaming wafer from its housing, an orichalcum data sliver. "Sister Helena's," he murmured, his voice filtered and distorted by his own helmet. Her recorded visions, her last moments. On a pillar that still stood defiantly, someone had chalked a message in a child's hurried shorthand. Mara traced the letters with her finger. Bell, quiet, 6 stones, be still. It was a clue, a fragment of a pattern. Luca's work? Helena's? They noted it, a piece of the puzzle in this desolate place. Following the outline of the mission, Mara anchored the ark on the ruined altar, the only piece of furniture that remained largely intact. She drove the anchoring spikes into the stone, the action feeling both sacrilegious and necessary. As the ark's cables were secured and the device hummed to full power, something remarkable happened. The chaotic static in Mara's skull, the ever-present pain behind her ear, didn't just lessen, it smoothed into a coherent tone. It was a frequency purer than any she had felt in the Valley of the Word. The hum of the ark aligned perfectly with the resonance of her graft, and for the first time in years, the sensation was not one of violation, but of alignment. A profound, unexpected peace washed over her, so powerful that tears welled in her eyes, cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. This was what they sought. This was the silence. The ark's printer came to life with a steady tick-tick-tick. A thin ribbon of waxed paper began to unspool, covered in neat postage-stamped numbers, the latency tables they had come for. The mission was a success. But as the numbers printed, the whisper returned. It did not come from the ark or from her own mind. It emanated from the darkened transept, from the deep shadows where the saints' faces had been worn away. It was the same parade ground cadence she had heard in the valley, but closer now, hungrier. Prepare to present arms. The words were followed by a sound that froze the blood in their veins. A shudder ran through the basilica's floor. Not an explosion, but a rhythmic, grinding vibration. The pews, heavy with rot and damp, began to tremble, their wood groaning in protest. Something heavy was approaching from the darkness, moving with the relentless mechanical cadence of a drill sergeant's nightmare. The mission was a success, but their escape had just become impossible. Chapter 3. The Ghost King's Court of Scrap. The grinding vibration intensified, shaking dust from the basilica's crumbling vaults. From the darkened transept, a monstrous shape emerged into the nave, blotting out the faint light from the shattered rose window. It was a tank palanquin, a throne cobbled together from the carcasses of 3 different armored vehicles. Mantlets and torn hatch lids were welded into a jagged chair, borne on bogey wheels scavenged from the ruins of war. It moved with a shrieking metal-on-metal cadence, a parody of a royal procession. Seated upon this moving throne was the Ghost King. He wore a coronet fashioned from spent cartridge casings and a cloak stitched from the tattered trench coats of fallen officers. His face was a pale, waxy mask, but his voice when he spoke was a thunder that echoed from the basilica's walls, a voice accustomed to barking orders across parade grounds. "Stand to," he boomed, the words a reversed homily, a prayer turned inside out. His eyes, burning with the same cold spite as his troopers, scanned them, lingering on the ark. "What have we here? A new class of recruits? Late for inspection." Escorting him were a full squad of trench ghost troopers, their movements unnervingly synchronized. Their bayonets were not of standard issue. They were forged from broken faith and hardened habit, gleaming with a dull, malevolent light. The palanquin's procession included a grotesque train of loot, sacks bulging with dog tags that clinked together like macabre rosaries, and lashed to the front platform with telegraph wire was a boy, Luca. His eyes were milk-glazed, his small body limp. A low, rhythmic hum emanated from him, the very cadence the Ghost King favored, a human metronome for his dead army. The king's gaze fixed on Joram's Oculus helmet. "An observer, come to witness our eternal drill? Good, we require names." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial rumble. "Names are the only currency here, the only thing that lasts. My men have drilled this patch of hell for a decade. We know the steps, the forms, but we lack the final beat, the beat of heaven's own parade ground." He leaned forward, his cloak rustling like dried leaves. "Your machine, it hears the word, does it not? Teach us its cadence. Let us drill to the rhythm of God. We will seize heaven by parade step." Joram, sparks of frantic insight visible as faint flickers under his fractured visor, stepped forward. He bowed slightly, a gesture of deference that seemed both genuine and a calculated distraction. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice amplified and distorted, taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "The gate of God rises in the valley of the Word, a conduit to the divine. Its song would make your current drills seem like the stumbling of children." He wove a tale of impossible architecture and celestial frequencies, a narrative designed to captivate the vain, eternal ambition of the king. Kamal saw the gambit and played his part. He spoke not of divinity, but of practicality. "There are protocols for exchanges," he stated, his tone that of a logistics officer, not a supplicant. "Ceasefires. The Church values the child. The Iron Sultanate values stability. An arrangement can be made." The Ghost King listened, his head cocked. For a moment, a flicker of something like consideration passed over his waxy features. Then it vanished, replaced by a parade ground snarl. "Arrangements? Ceasefires?" He laughed, a sound like gravel spilling from a bucket. "We are past arrangements. We are the eternal garrison." His voice rose to a shriek. "Fix bayonets!" The command echoed, and the trench ghosts moved as one, their phantom rifles snapping to the ready with a sound like 100 bones breaking at once. But in that moment of crisis, Mara's eyes were locked on Luca. His hands were bound, but his fingers were free. And they were moving, drumming silently against his thigh. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, a pause, then again. 6 beats, the code from the chalk on the pillar. Bell, quiet, 6 stones. Hope, cold and sharp, pierced Mara's fear. Luca was still in there, fighting the hum that controlled him. She caught his glazed eyes and tapped 2 fingers against the side of the ark. A simple, deliberate signal. "I see you." Luca's humming faltered for a fraction of a second. His eyes blinked, and in that blink, Mara saw a flash of the terrified child she knew. He was present. He was fighting. The king's patience had expired. "You seek to bargain with a king? You have nothing I want but the machine and the child's song. Take them." As the ghost troopers advanced, Mara acted on instinct. She couldn't fight them, but she could fight their rhythm. She slammed her hand against the ark's control panel, flooding its output with a simple, powerful counter-rhythm, the basic 9-beat calm of the Synod, but amplified, distorted into a weapon. The air pressure in the nave seemed to shift. The nearest ghost troopers, their perfect drill so dependent on the king's cadence, stumbled. Their synchronized movements collapsed into confusion. Uniforms that had moved as one now jerked and faltered, the air within them remembering a different step. The Ghost King shrieked, not in pain, but in fury. He bellowed a battalion number, a date, an honor, a litany of his past life that was a curse in the present. 3rd Battalion, Psalm, 1916. Kamal didn't hesitate. He threw a smoke bomb he had been palming. Thick, gray smoke billowed through the nave, swallowing the pale figures of the ghosts. "Go!" he yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. Joram hauled on the ark's cables, disengaging it from the altar with a shriek of protesting metal. Mara stumbled under the sudden, unbalanced weight, but Kamal was there, grabbing her arm. Together they crashed through a side aisle, splintering a rotten pew, and found a low, arched doorway leading down into darkness. They half fell, half scrambled down a narrow stairwell into the crypt, slamming a heavy, iron-bound door behind them. Joram jammed it shut with a broken reliquary case, the bones of some forgotten saint scattering across the stone floor. The crypt was a world of silence after the chaos above. The air was cool and still, smelling of old stone and damp earth. The only light came from their lantern and the faint glow of Joram's oculus. The space was dominated by a strange geometry, 6 stone sarcophagi arranged in a perfect hexagon. In the center of the hex, a heavy, rusted iron bell clapper lay on the floor. There was no bell. The ark, which had been screaming its counter-rhythm, quieted. Its hum dropped to a near-silent purr. The printing needle, which had been jerking erratically, began to tick with a calm, steady rhythm. This place, this substructure, was the true source of the silence, a natural resonance cage. Above them, the palanquin ground across the nave, its chains snapping against the stone floor. Dust snowed down from the ceiling, and then a new sound wound its way down the stairwell. Not the king's rage, but Luca's humming, softer now, threaded with a desperate, fading hope. It was followed by the king's voice, suddenly changed. It was friendly, almost paternal. "Come now," it coaxed. This is no place for the living. Amnesty, I promise. Officers pay for the living child in the machine. Just open the door. The words were smooth, reasonable, and more terrifying than any shout. They were the voice of a drill sergeant who knew that sometimes a promise was sharper than a bayonet. Chapter 4, Psalm of Salt. The Ghost King's voice was a drill sergeant's lullaby, smooth and insidious, seeping through the cracks in the iron-bound door. Think of the child, it cooed. Think of the warmth, the noise up here. It can all stop, just a little cooperation. Dust sifted down from the ceiling with every grinding pass of the palanquin overhead. In the crypt's hushed silence, the calm was a fragile egg. Joram moved with a frantic, focused energy. He dragged the ark to the exact center of the hex formed by the 6 sarcophagi, his hands shaking as he laid the synaptic cables in a precise pattern on the cold stone floor. The air itself seemed to thicken, the crypt's natural resonance amplifying the ark's low hum into a palpable pressure. Helena knew, Joram whispered, more to himself than to the others. He held up the orichalcum wafer, its surface gleaming in the lantern light. She found the cage, but she didn't have the key. With a final decisive motion, he plugged the wafer into a secondary port on the ark. A new frequency joined the hum, a woman's voice, broken and static-laced, chanting a metric pattern. Sister Helena's last recording, her final moments becoming part of the machine's algorithm. Then Joram's hand went to his pocket. He pulled out the tin of martyrdom pills given to him by the dying pilgrim. Mara saw his intention and lunged forward. "Joram, no!" He evaded her grasp, his smile thin and terrible behind the oculus visor. "Pain holier than fear, remember?" he said, echoing the pilgrim's words. He pried the tin open. Inside were several small, waxy pills. "What are you doing?" Kamal demanded, his back pressed against the shuddering door, his scimitar held ready. Joram's voice was calm, a lecturer explaining a dreadful theorem. The Psalm of Salt is a doctrine code, a weapon of last resort. It must be sung, not just printed. A living nervous system must act as the consonant to keep the phase clean, to give the sound a shape that can cut. He glanced at the door, where the king's friendly promises were now mixing with the sound of dead hands scraping at the wood. A prophetic tactician would be ideal. A child like Luca, his mind already tuned, it would produce a perfect, clean frequency. He looked at Mara, and the sorrow in his hidden gaze was immense. It would also likely burn his mind out. Leave him an empty vessel. He popped a pill into his mouth and swallowed dryly. So, I will be the consonant instead. He opened the panel on the ark that housed the primary synaptic port, the one intended for a tactician. Wires and filaments gleamed within. This port is designed for a child's smaller interface. It will be a rough fit. As the ark's antennae unfurled fully in the cramped space, they brushed the low stone ceiling like metal wings. The door bulged inward with a splintering crack. Chains from the palanquin snaked through, and pale, grasping hands followed, clawing at the air. The king's voice shifted again, dropping the pretense of friendliness, now layering his words with a drill sergeant's hypnosis, a cadence designed to turn their own feet against them. "Present, arms by the numbers, 1, 2. Kamal planted his boots firmly on the stone steps. He drew his scimitar and began to pray, not in a shout, but in a low, steady murmur. His words were in his own tongue, a language of fortifications and mathematics, and they formed a wall of faith that subtly undercut the king's commanding rhythm. Joram didn't hesitate. He jammed the synaptic connector from the ark into a secondary port on his own Oculus helmet. A jolt went through him, and he gasped. Then, with his other hand, he shoved the cable from the primary port into the raw, open socket at the base of his own skull, where his spine met the helmet's housing. It was a violation, a brutal, self-inflicted wound. He screamed, a short, sharp sound of agony, then clenched his jaw. The martyrdom pills took effect. A tremor ran through him, but his voice, when it came, was clear, amplified by the Oculus, and fed directly into the ark. He began to chant the Psalm of Salt, his words following the broken meter of Helena's recording. It was not a song of praise, but of unmaking, a doctrine of silence. Mara, her own connection to the ark still live, rode the interface. She closed her eyes, shutting out the horror, and focused on the sound. She hunted for the space Joram had told her about, the quiet after be and before come. It was a gap in the fabric of the word, a moment of pure potential. She found it, a microscopic point of stillness in the raging torrent of sound. With all her will, she held the phase there, anchoring the terrible power Joram was unleashing. The ark emitted a soundless pressure that filled the crypt. It tasted like salt and old tears. The effect on the other side of the door was immediate and horrific. The scraping hands ceased. There was a sound like a vast sigh, and then the rustle of collapsing cloth. The trench ghost troopers were unraveling, their uniforms emptying, the air that remembered marching released back into the indifferent dark. The palanquin above groaned, a final, metallic death rattle, and then came the sound of armor plates and bones spilling to the ground like a pile of junk. The Ghost King resisted. He bellowed not commands now, but his own identity. Ranks, dates, honors, the litany of his existence, he shouted them like a shield against the silencing wave. Captain, Victoria Cross, Ypres! The names were his armor, and for a moment they held. Mara, feeling the strain of holding the phase, remembered Joram's lesson about mercy. She reeled the frequency back an inch, away from pure annihilation and toward absolution. The king's voice cracked. The dog tags on his cloak, the thousands of names he had collected, jangled wildly and then fell silent, the cords snapping. The names, his currency, his power, tumbled free from his cloak, scattering into the darkness at his feet like a net full of fish released back into the sea. There was a final choked gasp, and then only the echo of silence. Up in the nave, Luca's lashings went slack. He slumped to the platform, his small form limp. The milky glaze cleared from his eyes, leaving them drained and hollow, but his own. Kamal, seeing the danger had passed, scrambled up the stairs and hauled the boy down into the safety of the crypt, placing him within the protective circle of the 6 stones. Joram was burning. The Oculus helmet frosted over from the inside, a rime of ice forming on the orichalcum visor. The Ark's printout tape, now streaming with the final successful latency tables, pooled at his feet like a white flag of surrender. His chanting had stopped. He stood rigid, a conduit that had channeled too much power. Then, as the last of the psalm's energy dissipated, his body went limp. Kamal caught him before he could hit the stone floor, gently lowering him down. Joram did not move again. The silence that settled in the crypt was absolute, broken only by Luca's shallow breathing and the Ark's steady, calm ticking. They had the latency tables. They had Luca. But as the basilica's roof groaned ominously above them, buckling under its own weight now that the king's will no longer sustained it, they knew with a cold final certainty that they did not have Joram. Chapter 5, Names on the Ark. The night train back to the Valley of the Word moved with a weary, lurching rhythm, a stark contrast to the frantic journey out. Inside the dimly lit wagon, the only sounds were the clatter of wheels on track and Luca's soft, uneven breathing as he slept on a bed of straw. His small hand twitched occasionally, resting beside the ark of the signal, which was now strapped quiet and dark, its mission complete. Folded neatly on the wagon floor next to it was Joram's empty Oculus helmet. The frost on its interior finally melted away, waiting for a head that would never fill it again. Mara sat opposite, watching the darkened landscape slide by. At the horizon, the gate of God throbbed with a new steady light, a lighthouse in a sea of war. The first full test alignment with their hard-won latency tables was underway. The tower sang on a frequency too low for most human ears to hear. But Mara felt it as a change in pressure, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in the marrow of her bones. The valley's very stones seemed to answer, the ancient prayer stones humming in sympathetic resonance. When they arrived, the reception was efficient and cold. A synod prior, his face obscured by the hood of his robe and his hands sheathed in white gloves, accepted the waxed paper rolls from Mara without a word of thanks. He was already dictating to a scribe, his voice a dry monotone. Latency tables confirmed. Proceed with Phase 7 construction on the gate's inner ribs. The mission is logged as a qualified success. The words were a clerical epitaph for Joram. The Watchers filed a commendation for doctrinal ingenuity, a phrase that felt as hollow as a chorister's hymn. No one spoke Joram's name. In the economy of the Synod, he was a variable that had been successfully expended. In the days that followed, Mara moved through her duties like a ghost. The static in her skull had returned, but it was different now, a familiar ache instead of a screaming violation. She found she could not sleep in the receptor's barracks, the silence feeling like a betrayal. Instead, she went to the calefactory. She bartered away her sleep shifts, her extra rations, anything of value for 5 minutes alone with the Ark's casing. The technicians, pragmatic men who understood loss in their own way, allowed it. Under the glow of the forge lights, with a nail and a sliver of salvaged orichalcum leaf, she began her own ritual. She did not pray. She engraved. With painstaking care, she etched names into the dark wood of the Ark's side, names that would never appear on any Synod scroll. Helena, Joram. Then she added others, a line of receptors she had known who had been sent out and never returned. She pressed the delicate orichalcum leaf into the grooves, gilding the names in the sacred metal. Finally, she sought out Luca in the infirmary. The boy was quiet, his eyes distant, but he hummed only when the wind played through the gate's half-built scaffolding, a natural sound that held no trace of the Ghost King's cadence. "Do we still write names?" Luca asked her one afternoon, his voice small. Mara showed him the Ark's new face. She took his small, pale hand and pressed it firmly into the soft, warm leaf, leaving the faint imprint of his palm next to the gilded names. Then she sealed it all under a coat of hard, clear lacquer, a testament, a memorial. The Ark was lighter now, its sacred purpose fulfilled, but it was heavier, too, by the weight of the names she had made present. Her rebellion did not stop there. Using the knowledge she had gained from riding the interface, from feeling its terrible architecture, she rewrote a single handshake subroutine deep in the Ark's logic. The Psalm's opening interval, the lethal alignment, would now first seek an adult's synaptic signature. It would refuse to align to a child's mind without a manual override from a senior observer. It was a small sin against the Synod's efficiency, a possible heresy. She deemed it a necessary one. Corporal Kamal Feridun found her as she finished. He held orders to return to his artillery detachment. He stood before her, his janissary uniform still impeccable, but his eyes held a new depth, a weariness that mirrored her own. "I misjudged the ledger," he said, his bluntness now tempered with a quiet respect. He held out his hand. In his palm lay his prayer coin. "For the spaces between your words," he said, repeating Joram's lesson back to her. "The Synod counts costs in machinery and latency. They do not count the cost of names. I will speak of this mission to my Sanjak Bey. The Iron Sultanate understands the price of walls. Perhaps it can learn the price of silence." He pressed the coin into her hand, a simple, worn piece of metal that felt heavier than any orichalcum. Then he turned and was gone. At dawn, Mara stood once more in the Valley of the Word. The gate's song was a constant, grounding presence now, a carrier wave underlying the chaos of war. Luca was beside her, his hand in hers. He looked up at the towering ribs of the gate, his eyes clear. In the hush between the gate's powerful transmissions, in the quiet after be and before become, Mara listened. She heard not the voice of God, but the echo of Joram's sacrifice, the memory of his lesson. And in that space, she held it, not as a weapon, but as a refuge, a small, fierce mercy humming beneath the thunder of divinity and the din of war. A watcher approached, its horns of light casting no shadow in the growing dawn. A new mission, a new sight to calibrate. Mara nodded. She stepped forward and knelt. Technicians approached with the synaptic cables. As the cold connection was made and the familiar taste of frankincense and battery acid flooded her mouth, she straightened her back. She settled the weight of the Ark on her shoulders, a weight she now knew how to carry. It was lighter somehow by the weight of the names she had etched into its soul, and heavier with the responsibility they represented. The Ark's carrier was ready.